Okay, so greetings and welcome back to class. Today we are discussing alternative urbanisms, the iconic Black ghetto and the Black Mecca. So this comes from your reading from myself and a colleague of mine, Dr. Renee Skeet. She is a sociologist and an urbanist out of Chicago. And this was a piece that we wrote together. And so this is the second half of a larger chapter in a book called Alternative Urbanisms. So we can go ahead and get started. Um, if we go to the next slide, one of the important parts of this idea of Black Meccas, or the iconic ghetto in the Black Mecca. This conversation looks at the ways in which class plays a role in the making of a Black community, right? And when we look at the iconic ghetto, what you probably saw either in previous classes or in the reading is this notion of an iconic ghetto as a place or a space where Black people preside. The notion of a ghetto is a place where Black people reside, particularly poor or working class people. And out of this spatialization of race comes survival tactics, survival mechanisms, and a culture that is often referred to as ghetto culture, or ghetto behavior. Oftentimes, this behavior or these norms or ways of life are looked at as being negative, right? Sometimes it can be positive, sometimes it can be negative, sometimes it can be seen as negative or positive, and sometimes the word ghetto is used as a way of degrading a group of people, right? It actually came out of the spaces that housed a lot of Jewish people, right? They were often referred to as being placed in ghettos. This was, I can't remember what century it was. It was a while ago. That's actually one of the earlier times that you hear of the term ghetto. And then later on, it was applied to Black people in a more urban uh, setting, core. And so we talked about how this notion of the ghetto or the iconic ghetto is this way in which the white mind perceives Blackness or Black culture. So, regardless of the social class of a Black person, whether they're poor, working class, middle class, or upper middle class, their race presentation automatically in the mind of white people or white society places them in what they call the ghetto. So they automatically see anything that is Black as ghetto, all right? And so it is then this what Du Bois would call a proletarianization of a people. Basically, you take a people and no matter what their social class status is, whether they're rich or poor, they're seen as this lower substandard group of people, and then they're treated as such, right? So we talked about that in the iconic ghetto, the actual ghetto, and then this making of a ghetto in the minds of white people in white society, right? On the flip side, when we're talking about the makings of a Black community, a Black space, a Black place, and even a Black city, while we're talking about this notion of the ghetto and the iconic ghetto and the poor and working class and the urban sectors, there's also a part of Black cities that are known as Black Meccas. These parts of a Black city are the thriving parts of a space or a place, right? Oftentimes, when a city is known as a Black Mecca, right, then there is something unique, something special, something exciting, something um, of value, not only economic value, but cultural value and a political value to this place. And so typically, cities like this are places that often have a large Black middle class. So there is economic viability in this area. In addition to that, oftentimes there's a cultural scene that is booming, where there may be music and art and literature and dance happening in this area. And then sometimes you have very educated people in these areas, very educated, um, and some level of political or legal control exists in an area or a space or a city that is known as a Black Mecca. And so, what we're going to talk about today is the opposite view of Black place. We talked about the ghetto part, the iconic ghetto, and the working class, and parts where there people experience economic downturns, poverty, etc. But there's another part of Blackness that is the middle class or the upper middle class, or what is seen as the educated, the elite, right? The elite part of Blackness and what that means, right? What that stands for, and um, the race and the class and the space meanings around this thing, right? This phenomena of a Black Mecca. So, uh, first thing we talk about is this Black Mecca triumvirate, right? And when we think about Black Meccas, particularly in the United States, oftentimes there are three cities that come to mind. It is Harlem, New York in the 1920s. It is Washington, D.C. in the 1970s. And then it is Atlanta, Georgia in the later on in the 70s, but for sure in the 90s and 2000s, you see Atlanta. And in the current present day, you see Atlanta rising as this current Black Mecca, right? And so this Black Mecca triumvirate is how we start this conversation. First starts with the notion of Harlem. Harlem was in New York City, and it was the first city that was assigned the title of a Black Mecca, right? So by 1920, and this was during the time of the Great Migration, we talked about the Great Migration. During this time, Black people began to move from the South. The South was a very dangerous place for a lot of Black people. And now there were opportunities of jobs, opportunities of employment, opportunities of upward mobility happening in the North. And so with these opportunities, more Black people begin to take themselves and their families, leave the South. South was rife with lynching, Jim Crow, sharecropping, little opportunities. It's like, what can I do down here but stay on this farm? If I want to make something of my life, I got to go up north. And they begin to move to places like Chicago, St. Louis, Detroit, right? Philadelphia. And one place that really became popular was New York, specifically Harlem. Harlem eventually became a center for Black culture in the country, right? And it was labeled as a Mecca, right? When we talk about a Mecca, oftentimes there's no like one term specifically to describe a Mecca or a Mecca in general, but a Mecca is typically a center point for a group of people. So you have Black Meccas, you may have a woman Mecca. There have been titles of a gay Mecca, right? A Mecca is just a significant place or space where people of a certain group congregate, and there typically are characteristics that make that place unique and special and allow for the thriving of those people in that place. And so Harlem was seen as that because Harlem was this place for Black businesses. So typically during this time, Black people would leave the South, move up north, and they would open up a salon. They may open up a barbershop. They may open up a saloon. They may open up a club. They may open up a grocery store, a newspaper or a magazine store or something. And it was during this time that Black businesses began to thrive. People would come and start churches. So you had all these Black people here starting these positions, starting these jobs, getting these jobs, and they were taking this money and purchasing and buying in their own communities. So became this economic hub for Black people. It's also a happening spot for Black nightlife, with this onset of this new music called jazz. And jazz was very popular during this time. And it was during this time that very famous authors, musicians, entertainers, Billie Holiday, Louis Armstrong, Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, and others became popular by being involved in the nightlife and the entertainment of Harlem. It was also a key area for the Black resistance movement. So obviously there was racism all over the country, even in Harlem, even in New York, even in the North. And so it was here where you have folks like Du Bois, folks like Marcus Garvey, folks like, not A. Philip Randolph. I always forget the guy's name. He was the pastor of Abyssinia Baptist Church. I always forget his name. It's going to come to me in a second. But you have these people who became Malcolm X eventually, became key players in the Black resistance movement, right? So all of these descriptions help to solidify Harlem with this title as a Black Mecca, right? Oftentimes you would see this idea, or you would see um, in research, people calling this the Harlem Renaissance, right? The making of this new Negro, this new Black person. So this variety of self-expression, Black independence, this being a unique site for African Americans started kind of in Harlem. You know, to be honest with you, it really kind of started in New Orleans. That's my argument. I still need to do some more research. But really, New Orleans, I would argue, is probably the first Black Mecca in the 1800s, 19th century. But if we're talking about the 20th century, Harlem definitely would be it. And then after that, you have Washington, D.C., which is a site that comes up later. And so in the next slide, we have Washington, D.C. that's considered this Black Mecca because it had a lot of the same characteristics of Harlem, right? Black professionals, Black-owned businesses, etc. The one thing it had that Harlem did not have was a key historically Black college and university, which was Howard University. Also, there's another one, University of the District of Maryland, I think, or something. Can't remember. But that's another historically Black college in Washington, D.C. But most people know of um, Howard as the major university. And so DC became a key place for not only Black businesses and Black professionals, as more Black people began to get government jobs. So that's when a lot of them were moving to Washington, D.C., but also a key place for Black education, right? And education and enlightenment. And so all of these things contributed to the creation and maintenance of the city as a place that had a very rich Black history. And so not only that, but Washington, D.C. had a very large Black population. And so with a large Black population that exceeded over 70%, as well as them electing their first Black mayor in 1975, around the mid-70s, this area, this city, this district was called and labeled a Black Mecca or a chocolate city. Currently, the city no longer holds this classification because when you look at gentrification, when you look at the lack of investment in the area, when you look at how expensive Washington, D.C. is now, and more Black people moving out, it's not as Black or it's not as chocolate as it used to be. And so it's kind of lost this title. But for a long time, it was called, it was labeled either a Black Mecca, a chocolate city, etc. So we have that. And then lastly, in this Black Mecca triumvirate, you have Atlanta, Georgia. And so Atlanta, Georgia is considered I would say, the current Black Mecca of today, right? But really, if we look at it, I mean, there's so many different cities now that have large Black populations, right? But it's not just about the population being Black, because honestly, the city that has the most Black people right now is really Jackson, Mississippi. I think that's the city that has the highest concentration of Black folks. So it's not just about having a lot of Black people in an area that makes a city a Black Mecca or any place a Mecca, whether you're talking about a technology Mecca or I think what Palo Alto or um, whatever city in California is considered, um, a tech Mecca, right? Doesn't mean every person in there is a tech person, but tech runs the culture of that city. So same thing in Black Meccas, right? It may not be that everybody there is Black. Everybody in Atlanta is not Black, or in DC or Harlem, isn't or weren't Black. But uh, Black culture or Blackness and Black people have a large influence over what happens in these cities. So Jackson, Mississippi wouldn't be considered a Black Mecca because it has a lot of Black people, but white people still run the politics. White people still run a lot of the businesses, hold a lot of the wealth, and so there's not a lot of Black power in powerful, influential spaces and places where Black people inhabit those, right? So same thing in other places, but then you have other cities like a Chicago where there is some level of Black influence and Black power. Memphis, Tennessee is another place. And so you have these other spaces where Black people's influence, their voting, their money, their dollars play a role. And it has some level of strength in the layout and how the city moves forward. However, there are very few cities that are able to do that, like, or have as much Black influence as Atlanta. And so, although a lot of the economics is still run by very, very wealthy white people and a very, very wealthy white community, the politics, the culture, and the social identity of the city, Black people hold a little bit of that economic hold, as well as hold a lot of the politics, the culture, and the social movements of that city. And so you see Black culture at its highest rates in the politicians, in the business, and particularly in its middle class. Has a large Black middle class, professional, um, large Black professional class and groups in these areas. And it is also the hub of Black higher education because it has the largest consortium of Black colleges and Black universities in the world. So there's no other place in the world that has this many Black colleges and universities in one area in space like Atlanta. And so these characteristics make it very unique. Not to say that there are not other places that have Black businesses or Black college or Black politicians, but this is the one place that has all of these things at such a high level, which makes why people would consider it currently a Black Mecca, right? So we have that. Now, where the iconic ghetto meets the Black Mecca. So even in an attempt to improve inner city place, government policies continue to displace and oppress the most vulnerable residents of Black Meccas, right? So even though people may try to improve on what happens in predominantly poor areas, there still are policies and legislation that make it difficult if you are vulnerable in the category of race as well as the category of class. And so an example would be Hope 6 policies. And if you did your reading, you would see that Hope 6 policies were started in the 1990s. And what these policies did was they tried to address the issue of concentrated poverty in the United States. So if you look at after the 1960s and going into the 1970s, a lot of jobs were shipped overseas. A lot of big corporations and big businesses and factories were shut down because these um, owners and CEOs wanted to open up plants overseas and pay these people less money to do the same amount of work as you would pay a US citizen. They fattened their pockets, but unfortunately, it did not allow for the younger people the older people, particularly poor and working class, to be able to keep their jobs. And so unfortunately, many of them lost their jobs. And so it led to large levels of poverty in the 1970s and 80s. And research was done by a man by the name of William Julius Wilson, who helped to shed light on this concentrated poverty that made life in the inner city hell, to say the least. It was just very, very, very bad, with lots of violence, lots of drugs, lots of just extremely deleterious conditions for many people, right? People of color, white people. It was just really, really bad. Okay. So in the 1990s, the government decided to pass what was called Hope Six. And Hope Six policies was a set of policies that did away with these project buildings, these buildings and these structures that were placed in the middle of the city that housed and crowded. It was crowded with ghetto people who were considered to be residents of the ghetto, ghetto people, poor people. They did away with this housing, right, where all of this violence and drugs and everything was happening. They tore these projects down, and then they rebuilt buildings that were supposed to be mixed income. So they're saying, in order to fix our cities, we're tearing this down and we're going to build these mixed income communities. And that sounds good in theory. But the question is, well, when you tear these buildings down, what's going to happen to the people? Where are they going to live? Where are you going to put them? Right? Because they got to go somewhere. Okay. We give them vouchers and they move for a short amount of time until we can get the buildings, these mixed income houses back up. Okay, cool. Now we build these mixed income houses. Are you going to move these people back so that they can have an opportunity to live in these brand new federal government subsidized housing? Or what you going to do with them? Unfortunately, many of the people that were kicked out were not allowed to come back. They were put in housing outside of the city, outside of their networks, outside of their locales, their cultural and their economic locales close to their jobs. They were placed in those houses. And when the mixed income housing came back, new and improved, only a small percentage of those who were kicked out were allowed to come back, those poor and working class people. And a lot of this mixed income housing was available for middle class and upper middle class people to inhabit. And so we see where the iconic ghetto meets the Black Mecca in this type of an action and scenario. We also see how class, working alongside race, mixes with mobility and access. So institutions such as housing and employment have been historically cut off along racial lines. So you have issues like redlining. Some of you have maybe heard of redlining, where a red line is drawn around a specific area and certain people are not allowed to buy homes in these areas. And so it began to be illegal. Well, eventually that was illegal to redline, but for many, many decades, Black people specifically, people of color, but specifically Black people, were not allowed to buy houses in certain areas, even if they could afford it, because that would allow for them to be able to buy into a white neighborhood and be able to have the certain class opportunities that white people have. And so redlining, housing and education segregation, where Black people and white people didn't go to the same schools, didn't have the same opportunities when it comes to housing, when it comes to education, when it comes to job opportunities, et cetera. This helped to make mobility and access greater for white society and more difficult for Black society. And so we see that there are these ideas and these promises of equality, but there's a difference between policy and practice. You can even put out a policy that something should be done. You got to enforce it. You got to make people do it. The difference between policy and practice. And the Black people who benefited from the civil rights policies that were passed, Civil Rights Act of 1965, 1964, 4, 5, vote, I think that was 4. Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965, Housing Rights Act of 1968. all of these people that benefited were generally middle-class Black people who were already educated, already had money. They just needed a law that allowed them to move into the neighborhood. They had the money to move into a white neighborhood. They had the money to send their kids to a white school. They had the money to be able to afford these areas. They just didn't have the laws that let them do it. And now that they have it, now they got these opportunities. But what about the many Black poor and working class people that couldn't afford to take advantage of these policies and these laws? Civil rights movement didn't really do a whole lot for them. They lived in the same neighborhood before the policies were passed and after, because the policies dealt with race, but not necessarily class. Another way in which the iconic ghetto meets the Black Mecca is this notion of the outmigration theory. So the outmigration theory suggests that income rises as distance from the inner city increases. And so with outmigration, what is suggested is that one of the reasons why a lot of Black communities begin to fall, begin to some level of debilitation begins to happen in these areas, and you see these things happening in the urban core, is because there was this outmigration of the Black middle class. Right after the civil rights movement, this allowed for middle class Black people to now say, oh, we can live in this neighborhood, we can go to this school, we can live here, we can live in a house that will appreciate in value, double and triple what we paid in about 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Why not? And so you have this, what they call this out-migration of middle-class Black people to white suburbs, and this only left poor, working class, uneducated, unskilled Black people in these impoverished inner city areas. Before, in a Black area was very interclass. So while there were poor people, there were also working class people, there were middle class people, there were upper middle class people, there were educated people, uneducated people, skilled people, unskilled people. And so with this very interclass, diverse community, you have a balance of life. You have a balance of thought. You have leaders and you have the people who work for the leaders, but they all lived in the same area. But if all the leaders now have the opportunity to leave that area and they leave it, now this place within this place, there only exists people of limited class, people of a limited scope, people of a limited position. At least that is the way it is explained in the outmigration theory. Actually, Mayor Patillo argues this theory by saying, well, yeah, Black middle class moved, but they didn't go very far because many of them were still segregated from the very central parts of white neighborhoods, because white people also moved and they moved further out as well. So a lot of these integrated neighborhoods, when the white people moved out of those, they ended up just being Black middle class neighborhoods that weren't very far from the poor working class neighborhoods. So it's a very, very interesting concept, this notion of the outmigration theory. Distance, both geographic and economic, between the Black working and middle classes. Although legislation from the civil rights movement made movement possible, that movement was not boundless, and there were restrictions in the housing segregation, and that's what we just talked about. In addition, you also have, where the iconic ghetto meets the Black Mecca, this educational inequality. So even in the Black Mecca, educational inequality still exists. Segregation results in detrimental psychological effects for Black children. This was a doll test done by Kenneth and Mamie Clark, where they both did a test where they put dolls in front of Black children specifically. And they would ask the Black children, which doll is prettier? They would put white dolls and they would put Black dolls. From the children, they say, which doll is prettier? Which doll is smarter? Which doll is nicer? Which doll has more money? Blah, blah. All of the positive attributes, the Black children pointed to the white doll, said, this is the prettier doll. This is the smarter doll. This is, which doll would you want to be like? I want to be like the white doll. And all of the negative attributes, which doll is the ugliest? Which doll is the dumbest? Which doll is poor? They will point to the black doll. And the darker the doll, the uglier, the poorer that they thought that doll was. And then when they ask the last question, which doll looks like you? The black children will look at the black doll, and will look at the white doll, and they will point to the black doll and say, this black doll looks like me. And so it goes, and what they use, this doll test that was done in the 1930s, Kenneth and Mamie Clark argued that this was a result of segregation. When we segregate people based on race, it does a detriment to the minds of the people that receive the lesser of that segregation. This is what segregation is doing to the minds of Black children and to the minds of what you all will call American children, children that you say that you want to help protect and grow. This is what your society is doing. Housing and economic status are still barriers to full integration. So even in full integration, there is a certain class element that exists. So even if a person is allowed to move into a white neighborhood, et cetera, if you don't have the means to pay those high property taxes, you can't live there. And schools are oftentimes funded based on property taxes. So essentially, the quote unquote better schools are in the more expensive neighborhoods. And in general, more expensive neighborhoods are generally or likely to be majority white, unless you're in a Black Mecca where you have places like Atlanta, DC, LA, New York, Houston, a couple other places where there are these very rich Black neighborhoods. But that's not common across the United States. It's not common, right? So Black students who attend majority white schools usually have one of two outcomes. They either have improved academic performance, but also experience racial bias and discrimination, right? So this is what they found when they found what happens with integration in certain schools. Yes, a child may get a chance to go to a white school that has better books, that has better technology, that has smaller classes, that has all these things that children should have for schools, but in return, they may get treated unfairly. They may not be allowed to do certain things or be a part of certain things. The teachers may blame them for something that they didn't do. They get in more trouble by security, by SROs, student resource officers. And there's a lot of evidence to show in the research that this is very true, unfortunately, for Black students in predominantly white schools. With education inequality, race supersedes class and being the main determinant of access to quality education. So holding a higher class status does not necessarily prevent particularly Black male secondary students from feelings of invisibility, negative attitudes from teachers, and being stereotyped. So Black people still depend on education to achieve social mobility. Most times, if people within the Black community feel that they want to succeed, and from a class level, now this may be a little bit different now that there's this kind of tech boom happening in our society. But for a long time, you want to be successful, go to school, get an education, get a good job, make some money, then you can move up in the world. But in order for you to do that, you're gonna have, if you go to one of these white schools, you're gonna have to deal with feeling invisible. You're gonna have to deal with teachers mistreating you. You're gonna have to deal with teachers looking at you differently. And you're gonna have to deal with being stereotyped, right? And that was just the reality that many Black people faced or felt that they faced when dealing with integration, right? Middle-class parents are key in helping their children navigate racism at school, imparting them with the necessary social and cultural capital acquired from personal experience to overcome these challenges. And so oftentimes middle-class parents will say, listen, you're going to have to go to this school so you can get the best education, but you're going to have to deal with racism. You're going to have to deal with, being mistreated, stereotyped. So this is what you do, because I had to deal with it. This is how you handle it. This is, if you feel like this, don't do this. Come home, work it out, talk it out. I'll help fight your battles. We, this is what, we go to church, get spiritually and culturally uplifted, blah, blah, right? So these ways that Black parents use to help navigate through this educational inequality. False the belief that socioeconomic mobility reduces systemic racism's impact. That is false because some people believe, oh, well, the more money you make, then racism doesn't really hit as hard. Still does. It's just in a different way. And that oftentimes is what people find when the iconic ghetto meets the Black Mecca. Even in the Black Mecca, even in places where Black people are thriving and there's a prominent Black middle class, you still have a lot of these issues. And then lastly, for the informational part, politics as usual. One major element of a Black Mecca is the political influence that Black people have in the city. And that oftentimes is what separates Meccas from cities with a Black population again, is you have these cities with a large Black population, but their interests are not necessarily reflective of their culture. But in places like Atlanta, Chicago, and Baltimore, not only is there a large Black population, but you also have many or some politicians that whose interests and laws and movements sometimes are a reflection of what the people want. Unfortunately, there's a struggle under the minority representation assumption because many people believe that when political power cannot translate into power for the Black community, it's only illusion. So you have some Black people who may vote a Black person into office and they get excited, but then they don't pass any policies or laws that benefit their people. And then they spend the next 4 years in the same position and they're like, well, what did we vote you in for? And so folks like William H. Murphy say, if that political power doesn't translate into actual power and actual mobility for the Black community, then it's just an illusion. We might as well have voted a white person or a person of another race or somebody who, another person who would not have had our best interests at heart. So political power has to translate into community power. While minority representation can present an image of change and true democracy, turning a blind eye to these larger problems of class inequality and racism and police brutality, etc., can bring the issues of the iconic ghetto to the Black Mecca, making both institutions one and the same. If we don't have politicians, if we don't have city leaders, if we don't have influencers that see the importance of community power, that don't see the importance of people power, that don't see the importance of empowering the common person, the average person, providing more jobs, providing better housing, providing safer neighborhoods, et cetera, addressing police brutality, addressing racism in law enforcement, et cetera. If we don't have a politician that sees the importance, then the same things that happen in the ghetto, the iconic ghetto, both physical and mental, they also can happen in the Black Mecca, right? And so that means class doesn't make a difference. You still have the same conditions, right? So with that being said, I have this activity that I want you to do. It's called Life in the Mecca. I know it says 3 volunteers are needed to play, but we're not going to do it that way because we are not in person. So all I want you to do is just answer the questions, look at the scenarios, and then answer the questions, and you'll see the examples on the Canvas web assignment for details. And you see, pretend that you are either a politician, a student, a worker, and there is a scenario, and then you just answer that scenario. You type up and answer that question on a piece of paper. And there are instructions for that there. And so if you go on, you will see the scenario. Don't worry about where it says move back 2 spaces because there's not we're not in person. So you see that for the next few slides. And the last slide is just some key takeaways. So negotiation of place and acceptance based on identity happens along racial lines, status, social status, and class lines. Those excluded from these lines recreate the narrative by transforming these spaces through expressions of culture and ownership. So there is a creation of. Okay. I hope that didn't mess it up. I hope all is well. I think there was a shift somewhere. So I'm gonna stop recording. And yes, talk to you later.